We are here to begin the conversation about the Nurses Take DC rally coming up this April in Washington, D.C. I'm going to be there speaking on the main stage at the rally, and Beth, you're going to be there too, right?
Yes, I am. I'm so looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I know we're both really honored to be there with so many amazing speakers like Laura Gasparis-Bonfolio and so many other people. And a lot of nurses around the country are interested in what this rally really means, what the legislative agenda is, how nurses think about legislative advocacy, and why it's important to go to DC, what's going to happen there, what are we going to experience, and we want to try to begin to unpack that for you here in this series of conversations with allnurses.com. So what do you say, Beth? Shall we get started?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, Beth, you're much more versed in the legislative aspect of Nurses Take DC than I am. So, can you begin just like an opening salvo of explaining what this is about and why nurses are coming to DC in April and why we come every year now?
Yes. Well, I think a lot of nurses don't even know that there's pending legislation that's been introduced into the House and into the Senate to set mandated nurse-patient ratios. What nurses do know is that ratios are set by hospitals. They're not consistent across the United States. That results in, well, ultimately medical error, poor working environment, and many problems that are well documented in the literature. So nurses know about working conditions. What they may not know is that there is legislation to address that for the first time. So some nurses know that in California, where I live, there are mandated nurse-patient ratios. What does that mean? Enumerated in our legislation. In ICU, a nurse can have 2 patients, period, anytime, never can go over ratio. In telemetry, the nurse can only have 4 patients, day or night, weekend, anytime. So this has been, and it's true for every unit. Med-surg, it's 1 to 5, and so on. So what that's done is really protected patients. This has been since 2004, and every hospital abides by it. The hospital can't be in business if they do not abide by this mandated nurse-patient ratios. So it's not dependent on sick calls, availability of staff, different financial maybe reasons by the hospital or the employer. It's the way it has to be every day if you're going to be a hospital.
And Beth,
so now,
this is specifically in California, correct?
And it's only in California since 2000.
And this was legislated by the state legislature in California and signed into law?
Correct, in 2004. It's the law.
Okay.
It is the law. To the extent that when a nurse goes on a break, then her patients have to be covered, but not by another nurse who would end up with 8 to 10 patients, but by a nurse who, and you still have to stay under ratio. So it's at all times.
Okay. So in California, prior to this legislation that happened several years ago, yes, I'm assuming that some hospitals had some set ratios and other ones probably just kind of winged it from day to day. And nurses and patients probably saw what the consequences of that were. So can you paint a really brief picture of what you saw prior to the legislation happening in California? And then we'll take it to the national.
What I saw as a clinical bedside nurse practicing before 2004 was, and I'd worked in a couple different hospitals. Many hospitals had what they called acuity tools, and it was the nurse or the charge nurse's responsibility to determine the acuity of each patient, and a nurse would only have so much of an acuity workload, so maybe 4 very heavy patients versus 5 not so. In reality, I never saw that it was more than a piece of paper that got filed. They weren't followed. Their acuity tools are very easy for nurses to pad, and they were not reliable and valid, and they were pretty much all homegrown, and for managers to disregard. And so they were just kind of a Band-Aid Perhaps that's what I saw for the most part. There was never, what really drives staffing in the lack of mandated ratios is the budget. I've been a manager. In the beginning of the year or the fiscal year, you're given a budget that allows for so many nurses,
Mhm.
not based on acuity, just period. And that's what you're held to, regardless of what the acuity tool says. As a manager, you're held to the fact that you were budgeted for only, say, 40 nurses, and that was it.
So
So
that sounds like there was a lot of room for error. There was a lot of room for what you said was padding of the acuity. And then there was room for managers and supervisors and directors, for instance, to just kind of disregard that.
from what I hear, that's a lot of nurses can relate to that because there really aren't any good, valid, and reliable tools out there. So hospitals, like you said, are pretty much winging it in many different ways. And at the end of the day, it's the hospital that decides how many patients the nurse will have. And sometimes it's right down to the shift supervisor
I
who
see.
is pressured to take and admit, the pressure comes top down, and they're going to be asked by the administrator, why were patients held in the ED? You could have admitted, and you cannot say the nurses were too busy, had not had a break, it was unsafe. It just doesn't fly.
I see.
So that's how
So,
nurses work now.
right. And I know a lot of people listening and watching right now can relate to this so much. I mean, people are probably out there, yelling at the computer saying, that's my life. You're talking about my life right now. Now, Julie Gautreau, and Julie, I'm sorry if I'm really doing poorly with your name. She wanted to know, how long did it take to get this passed into law?
Good question. Thank you, Julie. I don't have the exact answer. I think it was 2 to 4 years. It took a lot of work and advocacy. It
Mhm.
took lobbying and maybe storming the Capitol. But I know that Keith asked me to paint a picture, and I do remember very much from that time. I was being called into work on a Saturday. And by called in, I mean they asked me if I would come into work extra. So I wanted to help out my teammates, and I did. When I showed up, it was 2003. I was given 10 patients on the telemetry unit
Wow.
and one nursing assistant for 20 patients. There was nothing to inhibit the hospital from doing that. And all I could think was, what if I hadn't come to work that day? But did I make mistakes that day? Maybe some that I don't even know about, but I certainly didn't leave feeling as if I'd given good care. That cannot happen anymore in California.
Right. That's a scary story. 20 patients on a telemetry unit. And Julie just said again, where she used to work at her old job, it was 2 nurses for a 20-bed emergency department overnight and 5 to 6 patients for 1 nurse at her old job.
Mhm.
And Bryce is asking, are there any regulations for nursing homes and assisted living facilities in California? Do you have any limits there?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. There are not as of yet, but my intuition from being linked into several different nursing groups and having such a strong interest is that there's a rising sense of consciousness in the United States about the poor care that the elderly and other people in residential facilities get. And that's going to lead to, I believe, well-needed mandated ratios there as well, because there's really so much abuse. We see stories all the time. Nurses can't stay and work there long term and do a good job. Patients aren't getting the care and so on. But what I believe is that when we mandate, we're going to start with acute care.
Mhm.
Started in California. It's been very successful. When it's mandated federally throughout the United States, the very next step is going to be nursing homes and assisted living facilities.
Great. So it's almost like the hospitals, it's acute care. So it's where patients are the most acute, the most sick, and we really
Mhm.
need that. We need to lean in on that particular issue. But
Mhm.
I'm assuming that the hospitals are sort of like the front line. If we can prove, if we can show and demonstrate and have actual data, we
Yes.
can quantify the impact of having those ratios, then there's a what would you say, sort of a mandate to move on and
Mhm.
expand the pool, so to speak,
Mhm.
right?
Exactly.
Okay. So if we blow this up now to the national, because a lot of nurses who are listening and watching from other states than California, I'm sure can relate to the story you just told about the telemetry unit back in 2003, I think you said. And I'm
Mhm.
sure a lot of them are saying that this is my life right now.
Mhm.
So we have arguments for and against legislation of nurse-patient ratios, and the Nurses Take DC rally, I think this is the third or fourth year it's happening in DC,
Third.
right in front of the Capitol, next to the
Mhm.
Supreme Court. And the purpose is to really advocate actively for legislative action on the bills that are before the Senate and the House.
Yes.
So if nurses come to DC, what are they actually putting their boots on the ground for?
We want the representatives in Senate and the House to hear our voice and know that we are their constituents
Mhm.
and we vote. And this is important. I will tell you that a lot of them don't know because nursing hasn't spoken up as a group, as a collective group. I will tell you who has spoken up is the American Hospital Association. Uh, Unfortunately, I have to say the American Nurses Association. I am a member, but I don't feel on this topic they represent the frontline nurse because they oppose this bill, as does the American Hospital Association, understandably. But they have, of course, strong lobbyists. And so the representatives, if all they hear is one side and they don't hear us, they're going to believe that's what we want because they are being told that it's safe and they should oppose this bill
Right.
and so on. Yeah, so by showing up there, by participating, and we'll talk later, more tomorrow, we're going to talk about different actionable things you can do. But by participating anyway, including attending,
Mhm.
you can be assured your voice is being heard, it's being taken notice of, it's going to be in the news, it's very public. Now, we're a grassroots movement. Those of us who show up, we're not formally organized. We don't
Mhm.
have lobbyists, we don't have a budget, but we are 3 million strong
Right.
and we have a responsibility to speak up.
Right. So tomorrow at the same time, we're going to be talking about actions you can actually take aside from coming to Washington, D.C., and what it means to be an advocate. And it doesn't just mean talking to your legislators, though that's one of the most important things
Mhm.
we want to make sure we drive home. But there are other actions you can take if perhaps you can't go to D.C. And there
Right.
are things you can do right from the comfort of your living room. And we will talk
Mhm.
about that tomorrow.
Mhm.
But Beth, when people come to DC, April 15th and 16th, 2018, right?
The April 25th and 26th.
25th and 26th, right? 15th and 16th, I'll be in California. I'm getting my
Yeah,
dates.
okay. Right.
Right. So when people come on the 25th and 26th of April, we're all going to be gathering. First, on the 25th, there's going to be some social meetings and networking at a hotel in Old Alexandria. So why is it important to come on the 25th and hang out with the other nurses and start to do some networking in DC?
Right. Just because of the importance of networking, which you talk a lot about, Keith, we are stronger together and we have to forge those professional relationships and support each other. And we'll just learn. I wouldn't miss the 25th for the world. Also, part of that day is going to be a legislative, and I believe they're offering CEs for how to take legislative action, which I need to learn more about, and it's going to be offered that day. So there's going to be a lot of value around that, the 25th. The 26th is the rally itself.
Right.
We'll be speaking, and I'll be speaking, and some way fabulous people are going to be speaking.
Mhm. Right. You and I each get 15 minutes. I think some of the main speakers will probably have some more time, I should hope.
Uh-huh.
And it's going to be really exciting. And one of the things I'll say about going to a rally or going to a public meeting, especially something right in the nation's
Mhm.
capital, right
Right,
there, is that the
right.
media will be there. And of course, we want to get our message across to the legislators in the building, and we will have opportunities to make appointments to meet with our legislators. But
Yeah.
there's also going to be TV cameras. There's going to be reporters from national, regional, and maybe even international news outlets. And part of our job representing our profession there will be to share our own feelings and opinions about the issue. And
Mhm.
of course, you'll be given talking points, and people will train you on the 25th if you're there about how to present this issue, but it's also your opportunity to tell your story. Tell the story of the telemetry unit where you're working with 20 patients at a time by yourself. Or Elizabeth K. Reese just posted here that she had a job of 1 to 30 ratio on average in skilled nursing and long-term care. And she says, this is ridiculous, stressful, overwhelming. What can we do to advocate for less patient-to-nurse ratios? This is our opportunity. This one is to speak truth to power, to speak to our legislators and let them know who we are, what we do, and why we think what we think. And it's also our opportunity to speak to the media. So there's a multi-pronged aspect of rallying, gathering, and being in one place together, because those numbers say a lot. And I think this is an important aspect of what nurses can do as the most trusted professionals in the United States. Wouldn't you say?
Right. Correct.
Yeah. So Beth, what else would you want to say to nurses who are thinking about going to DC and they want to know what the impact would be of just them going? Because they might say, well, it's just me. So what would you say to a person who's like, well, it's just my voice. What is my voice meant?
Join your sisters and brothers and stand up for really the right thing. And it's an opportunity. I will have regrets if I don't go. And it's a long trip for me. I'm in California. I'm going to go there. I've taken time off work. I mean, the only reason is because I feel it would not be right to not speak up, because I know the issues and I know it can be changed because we did it in California. So that means you can do it too. That means it can happen everywhere. And then as far as the long-term care question, like from Elizabeth, thank you, Elizabeth. There's so much you can do. In this next session, which is tomorrow, we're going to get into some actionable items. But one of the things you can do is to support this initiative. There are desperate voices coming out of long-term care that should be disturbing to all of us. Acute care, but long-term care is even worse.
Absolutely.
But supporting this legislation, the next step is going to be the same kind of reform that we all know we need for long-term care.
Right. And Elizabeth, thanks for your comment. And if you weren't listening, about 10 or 15 minutes ago, Beth was talking about the fact that in California, they passed this legislation for mandated nurse-patient ratios in acute care. And the numbers are now there. They can quantify the positive effects of those legislatively mandated nurse-patient ratios. So once we have those numbers, and remember, the nursing process at first is all about assessment, right? It's about the collection of data. So what we need to do is be able to show the data, show the numbers, so that we can then say to legislators, look, this really worked in acute care. Now let's focus on long-term care and assisted living. And that's where we'll need nurses like you, Elizabeth, to actually begin to lobby for the next wave of legislation. Now, you can act at the national level. You can come to DC. If you can't come to DC, we'll talk tomorrow about other things you can do. And you can also act at the local and regional and state level. Because even if there's no legislation in your state right now, like I don't think we have anything pending here in New Mexico, but you can begin the conversation by meeting with your state representatives and even local representatives to just open their eyes to that this issue even exists. So begin to put it on the map for them so that when they then hear about what's happening in DC, the pieces will start to come together and we'll think, oh, maybe that actually has some impact on my constituents here in my state. Does that make sense?
Right. Absolutely. We need to talk to them. They need to hear our voice.
Down below in the comments, we're going to make sure our Facebook Live team puts a link to the excellent article you wrote on nursecode.com, Beth, all about why you're in favor of this legislative agenda. And it'll be really great for people to leave. So we'll put that in the comment stream below so that those who are watching this video after the fact, or those of you watching now, can tune in to Beth's opinion and really get a very in-depth analysis from Beth with a lot of very high-level references. And Beth, I just want to congratulate you. It's an excellent article.
Thank you. And it's the pros and cons. So it's important to hear the arguments that oppose so you can think about them critically yourself, and then be able to respond to them, because some of them are really not that logical. You'll find as you read them. I really hope you'll read the article. So another thing, everybody listening, you can do to help me out, maybe not Keith, because he's a proficient and experienced speaker. You can help me write my speech. I'm supposed to give a speech in Washington, and I have 15 minutes. So if you have some talking points for me, feel free to type them in. I would appreciate it as I write my rally speech.
That's great. And Beth, you and I can have some conversations before we go to DC too, because
Absolutely.
I'm brainstorming at the moment. So Elizabeth K. Reese just said she's interested in going to DC. We had,
I want to meet you.
yeah, we had comments from Julie Gautreau. We had
Yes.
some other comments too. So people, and Bryce also gave a comment here. There'll be a discussion thread at allnurses.com accompanying this video. There will also be on the Facebook page, so you'll be able to see the discussion thread and continue to comment. Please share this video with others, and please come back tomorrow, Friday, at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern, and we will be back on Facebook Live to talk about actionable steps that you can take to begin helping in this legislative endeavor that we are all involved in right now, or most of us are involved in. And becoming educated is the most important thing you can do, because if you understand the underlying issues and the overarching issues, you can then speak to them from your heart and from your nurse's mind, from that intellect that you've developed as a nurse, and use your critical thinking to be able to make up your own opinion, make up your mind, and share your opinion about this issue. So Beth, my friend from California, Beth Hawks and nursecode.com, thank you so much for joining me today here with All Nurses.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Thanks. And everyone, we'll be back tomorrow. This is Nurse Keith Carlson, and Beth Hawks signing off from allnurses.com.